Genau, inhaltlich bleiben wir jetzt noch ein wenig in der Zukunft der Logistik mit einem leicht anderen Schwerpunkt. Und da freue ich mich sehr, Graham auf die Bühne zu bitten. Und zwar ist er nämlich Director of Green Business und eMobility bei Sennder. Und er wird eben jetzt mit uns nochmal gemeinsam einen Blick in die Zukunft der Logistik werfen. Kurz zur Info, die Keynote wird ja auf Englisch sein, richtig? Und
Genau.
das wäre dann nachher natürlich super, wenn ihr Fragen habt, die dann direkt auf Englisch reinzuschreiben. Ansonsten übersetze ich die auch gerne. Deswegen erstmal welcome in Duisburg, Graham, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Dankeschön. Ich freue mich, hier zu sein. Ich bin ein bisschen klüger auf Englisch, so ich mache den Vortrag auf Englisch, aber ich freue mich auf jeden Fall, hier zu sein. I'm at Sennder, and I'm the director of Green Business, as mentioned, and eMobility. And we are a full truckload transport company. And so I'd like to focus a little bit on what the future of logistics looks like from our perspective. First of all, the world is changing very fast. Does anyone remember this phone, which was the best-selling phone in the world? Can you just raise your hand if you remember this phone? Okay, and can you raise your other hand if you actually had this phone personally and thought it was very cool? A couple people, yes. I also had a very similar phone. I thought it was very cool. Does anyone know what the best-selling phone in the world is in 2023, Q1? Just call it out, please. iPhone, correct. Very good. Good guess. Now the question is, how long did it take for the iPhone to become the #1 selling phone in the world? Let's also get a few guesses. You, sir, here in the front. 10 years? Okay, good guess. Anyone over here? 10 years? Anyone over here on the left? 5 years? Thank you for the guesses. The answer is 1.5 years. And the point of that is that technology adaptation is exponential. It doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%. It goes 0.1%, 1%, 10%, 100%. If you think about how many people in this room have a non-smartphone, I would be willing to guess the number is fewer than 2. Probably 0. We are now in a period when we look at road transport that is very similar to 2008, right after the iPhone launched. It looks like things are the same, but actually everything is different already. Now we're in Duisburger Hafen here, and hopefully somebody can tell me the year in which the first container ship was ever on water. You could probably go to one of the exhibitions here and know the answer. Does anyone want to take a guess? The gentleman in the front here, please. 1930? 1920? Okay, good guess. And you, sir? 1970? Okay. The average is about right. The answer is 1957. 1957, if you think about that. And this is a photo taken from near where I grew up in Manhattan in New York City in the 1950s. Now, if you imagine that versus what sea freight looks like today in 2023, we are living in a completely different world, and I cannot imagine any of us would go back to boxes and hooks, and you can even see there's a scale here. There's a scale. That's unbelievable. Now let's look at road specifically when it comes to personal vehicles. If we go back to 2017, you can see that cars with batteries, and by that I mean chargeable vehicles and vehicles that recuperate energy from the wheels that also have a battery, also known as hybrid. In 2017, they had a market share of 4.3% in Europe. Last year, the full year data, 2022, 44.1% of new cars sold in Europe had a battery and an electric drivetrain. 12.1% of those are fully electric. So we can see that there's been a 40% market share gain. And of course, what that means is when we look at diesel, which is the dark gray, and gasoline, which is the light gray, there's been a 40% loss in market share for vehicles that run only on these. And I was talking to a gentleman this morning who was very happy to have a hybrid instead of a traditional vehicle. So that's down to 53%. And I think when we look at that, we can see what the future is looking like for the direction of batteries and the new technology versus the old technology, which is very, very quickly going away, just like in the iPhones. Now, electric trucks are approximately 3 to 5 years behind where personal vehicles are. Right now with electric trucks, we're very much in the, I would even say, 2015 part of this graph. But when we look at the regulations for Europe for 2025, we can relatively quickly figure out, according to an analysis that we did at Sennder, that between 50,000 and 80,000 electric trucks will enter the road in the year 2025. That's an enormous number because right now in Europe we have about 1,000. So that's a little bit about what's changing, a little bit into the future and these exponential changes that we need to keep in mind when we're understanding these dynamics. But there's also change that's already happening today. One example is when we look at the Fortune 50 companies. So what that means is the 50 largest companies in the United States, when they submit financial reporting to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the number of times they mention climate change, climate goals, renewable energy, and other related terms has absolutely exploded between 2019 and 2021. And this is going to continue to grow. We see simultaneously that more than 3,000 companies have made climate pledges that are public, and they are scientific-based. And anyone who knows science-based targets, that initiative, can go look up all those companies and see exactly what their targets are. This is a completely different world that we're operating in today than it was 5 years ago. What does that mean for us? Well, at Sennder, what we do is basically two most important things. The two biggest levers we have are advanced fuels and carbon accounting. On the one side, you notice we call them advanced fuels. We don't call them alternative fuels because we don't believe that digging dinosaur bones up out of the ground and lighting them on fire is nearly as advanced as running on sunlight or running on food waste. So advanced fuels can reduce emissions by up to 90% when compared to fossil diesel already today. And I'm going to show you a little bit more about that. We can reduce emissions up to 100% with electric trucks. Of course, that's in a much smaller number, as I just mentioned, but that's one thing that we're bringing onto the street already. Carbon accounting is the other thing that's enabled by the digitization of all of our transports. At Sennder, we automatically calculate the carbon footprint from every single transport. There's no sort of interns slogging away in the evening to put together some sort of Excel report to send to a customer or anything like that. It happens automatically. It's fully visible to all of our customers, and any Sennder employee can pull that information at any time. So when we look at the different fuels that are available in the road transport space, you can see the dark ones, these are fossil fuels, and over the last, let's say, 15, 20 years, there was quite a big push, especially in Germany, towards LNG, which is liquefied natural gas. I'm sure everybody here knows that. That actually has a very small improvement in CO2 emissions. It's about maybe 8%. At its worst, it actually increases emissions by about 5%. At its best, it decreases emissions by about 15%. And compressed natural gas is around 15, 20%. The ones on the left-hand side are in green, and you can see these are the fuels that reduce emissions by more than 50%. We've got biodiesel, we've got bio-liquefied natural gas and compressed natural gas. Those are made from food waste products. And then we have electric, which reduces emissions by about 75%. That varies very much by country. I'm going to show you in a minute. And HVO. HVO is also known as renewable diesel and is widely available today, even though it's more widely available than many people know about. Electric and HVO are the best ways that we can decarbonize road freight today. HVO also has one big advantage compared to biodiesel, where you see on the right. HVO can be put into any diesel engine without any engine modifications. So what that means is all you need is the Tankstelle, and you need the HVO to be there. You also can use existing diesel infrastructure, diesel pumps and diesel tanks. All you do is take out the fossil diesel and you put in the HVO and you're ready to go. So that's why when I do trainings at Sennder, we always say, HVO, here we go. This is where we offer HVO today. And you can see there's two different colors of green. One is the dark green, and this is where we do direct fueling of HVO in the customer's truck. And then we have the light green, which is what we call HVO Flex, and that is a mass balance product where essentially our customer buys a liter of fuel, or let's say 350 liters of fuel for 1,000 kilometers, that we then fuel in other trucks in our network. And so with this, combining the access to fuel that we have directly through fuel stations and in our network with our digital platform, we're able to essentially decarbonize up to 90% for any transport that runs through Sennder today. That is a completely different world to be operating in than the one of 10 years ago, where HVO was very difficult to get and things were not digitized. So this is where we start to see the exponential upward adoption of decarbonization in road freight. And just so you really believe with your eyes, seeing is believing, I know that's true. This is one of our trucks driving into a fuel station. You can see it's a ganz normale Tankstelle. There it is, HVO 100%. And here's our handsome guy checking the fuel pump, making sure it's full, and he's decarbonized his freight for us by 90% compared to fossil diesel. Now, switching gears to electric truck, or switching Antrieb, I should say, we're going to electric trucks. When we look at the average electricity mix from different countries, you can see that that has a big impact on the carbon reduction when compared to diesel. If you look at the EU average, and this is 2022 numbers, but won't have changed much, 63% would be the EU average. And we look at countries like France, who have a high percentage of nuclear electricity. They also have some renewables. That's reducing emissions by 92% compared to diesel. Now we go down and we end up, okay, Germany reducing emissions by 49%. That's actually excellent because that means we can run 2 transports for the same amount of emissions that we would have otherwise been running 1 transport. And I met the guys from Trailer Dynamics before, and maybe you throw an electric trailer on there as well, and these numbers become even more efficient. Then you also see the example of Poland now, and Poland has a lot of coal on their electricity grid. You can see that if you just ran the electric truck on the Polish electricity average grid, you would actually be increasing emissions by 10% by running electric compared to diesel. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't run electric in Poland. What that is to say is we should do this intentionally as we go through this process, because I believe that as more and more renewables are built in every country, all countries are going to be going up to the direction of the top of this list rather than down. Secondly, if we're in Poland and we build solar panels on the top of our logistics center and we do direct charging there, then we're achieving 100% reduction. So there are ways to do this that are even better than what the average electricity grid allows for, and that's something that can also be considered in the planning phase. I'm just going to go through this quickly, but this is essentially another aspect of this exponential adoption that's going to happen over the next 5 years. So we've got the early adoption case. Let's say 120 kilometers, and it's sort of a 4-hour loop, and there'll be 1 charging station on that, either at the pickup or the drop-off point. And then the expansion case, and that's sort of where most of the pilots today are happening. The expansion case for some companies is, okay, well, we're actually going to expand that. Instead of driving 120 kilometers and getting back to home base, we're going to drive, let's say, 200, 250 kilometers, and we're going to do 2 rounds of charging, probably 2 fast chargers, maybe 1 on the highway and 1 at the home base, some sort of setup like this. Now we go to phase 3, and this is where you can see the change is exponential in terms of the complexity, because we're talking about dynamic highway charging, not planned charging periods. And that's why right now where we are is really phase 1 and phase 2 when it comes to electric trucks. Phase 3 is going to be 2026 or even beyond, because that is a much more complex thing to do. So when we look at where do electric trucks fit into the overall picture today, we can see that okay, if we have a diesel truck bouncing back and forth between a factory and a warehouse, that's something that's easy to switch out for electric, and the economics might work out quite well if it's well planned. Phase 3, dynamic, that is very unlikely to be switched out today. So this is a picture of our first Sennder electric truck with our partners at HN Post and Sonnen and Breitner, and you can see this is charging at a Shell station. Does anyone notice anything about this charging? Does anyone notice that our truck is taking up 2 charging spaces? Yes, exactly. So we can charge. It's a fast charger, and it works quite well. And our friends over at Shell are very kind to let us do this. But it's one example of how things will continue to improve over time. It's not only about having the charging infrastructure, but it's also about having the space for trucks to park while charging, and taking that into account. So, I mean, we're only paying for 1 kilowatt hour at a time, but actually we might as well be costing them too. And then the last thing I'd like to identify just for thought for each of you as you think about, okay, is this going to be a 1%, 2%, 3% growth, or is this going to be, like Graham is proposing, an exponential growth from very little to 1% to 10% to 100%? Here's some exponential trends that are impacting electric trucks. One is battery density. Battery density is getting better by 11% every year. What that means is the batteries you have in 6 years from now will be twice as dense as today. We already see this with our first truck, which you just saw the picture of, versus the second truck we have on the road. The first truck had about 150 kilometers max range. Our new truck has 320. That's exactly the type of change that we're expecting. The battery cost is falling 15% every year. What that means is that in 5 years, that same battery costs half as much. So in 5 years from now, you're going to have a battery that's twice as big, that costs half as much. And that's when we start to see these game-changing dynamics come into play when it comes to putting these trucks on the road and who is able to pay for them. If we go through that cycle twice and we say, okay, in 10 years, we're going to have a battery that's 4 times more dense, so 4 times larger, and it costs 25% of what it costs today, we can quickly see that the economics are changing fundamentally in favor of an electric world rather than a fossil fuel-driven industry. And then lastly, you see also charging stations are growing by 35% every year. That means we double in between 2 and 3 years the number of charging stations. And then global EV production is growing about 55% every year. That's true for 2022 versus 2021, and it's true for 2021 versus 2020. And we may see that again this year, driven by Europe. The US has a new legislation that just came into place, which I'm sure many of you saw, and also China. So the 3 biggest economies in the world are all driving in the same direction, and that leads to exponential technology adoption. So just to summarize, where we think the Zukunft der Logistik is one, it's going to be digital. That doesn't just mean it is not on pen and paper. It also means that it's smart. And when Dana was talking about ChatGPT, we can see that that's the first example. We're just at the beginning of the adoption for smart choices made by computers. In 10 years, that's going to be a no-brainer. Siri, by the way, launched 11 years ago. Siri on your iPhone, right? Launched 11 years ago. Think about the difference between Siri and ChatGPT, and now do another 10 years of growth on top of that. What's that going to be? That's what we should expect for smart freight. Second is low carbon. It looks like it's sort of the alternative right now, but we really believe that this is going to be the backbone of the logistics industry, both electric and low carbon fuels. And then lastly, autonomous trucks. We can debate about when that's going to happen exactly. That has many factors that are going to come into play, but let's just drive down the road and we say 30 years in the future, a lot of trucks are going to be autonomous. That's also going to fundamentally change the way the industry operates in a way that will combine with both low carbon and digital to change things. So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to future discussions this afternoon, and also if there's any questions now, we'd be happy to take them. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Graham, for your thoughts and insights. Are there any questions from your side? I check online. I can't see any questions, but I got one for you, and it's focusing on, at Sennder you have a really strong focus on trucks, I think. And are there any thoughts about different solutions for any other transport solutions?
Yes, absolutely. So when we look at the air freight industry, for example, I was at Tag der Industrie 2 years ago, and the CEO of Airbus was there, and he got a very similar question. And his answer was, look, every single Airbus plane that has been produced for the last 10 years can run today on 50% renewable aviation fuel without a single change. All we have to do is put 50% renewable aviation fuel into those planes, and we've reduced emissions for our airplanes and our Luftfracht by 45%. Compared to what it is right now. So that's simply a choice that industry can make. It's also a choice that governments can make. So I don't want to say it has to be necessarily regulation, but I personally believe that there is demand for the low-carbon air freight and also low-carbon passenger transport. So that's one example, and there are similar things that are happening for the the Seefrachtindustrie that are basically similar to HVO, as I mentioned. I believe there's some work with methane. I think everyone here knows better than I do about that. But there's basically the same type of approach, switching out the old fossil fuels for new ones without changing the engines, is possible in basically every industry.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. There's no next question, so thank you for your time, for
Thank you.
joining us today, and yeah, thank you.